Hi, welcome back to Guitar Wisdom. My name is Dan Malott. This is part 3 of our series for understanding the guitar using the CAGED system. And in parts 1 and 2, we talked about how you can place scale shapes and chord shapes up and down the neck of the guitar, all in a single key, so that you learn how to move all of these shapes up and down as if the entire neck is used as one key. Very important information for how you're going to be able to understand the neck of the guitar. In part 3, we're going to look at some ways that you can use this system in practice so that you can start to internalize some of these shapes, begin the very long process of memorization of all the fingerings, and just generally be able to use this spontaneously without a whole lot of mental processing, which at first is inevitable. You're going to need to do a lot of mental processes. You're going to need to think very hard about how these shapes sit on the neck. But hopefully some of the things that we talk about in part 3 here will help ease this transition. So we're going to do a quick recap here. If you watch parts 1 and 2, then this should be pretty simple. Let's just talk real quickly about how you might go about finding the correct placement of the positions for the CAGED system in a given key. So in the examples of part 1 and 2, we used the key of G. We'll use a different key just to demonstrate how this works in another key. Make sure you go back and revisit those. Now, if you'd like to have some diagrams for reference out in front of you while you do this, you can go to my website. That's danmalott.com/guitarwisdom, and I've got some downloads for you there so that you can print out a reference sheet of the examples. I have those examples in G. You're going to have to do a little bit of creative imagining how you're going to move those up and down the neck to get the other positions, but hopefully it's clear enough how you're going to do that. So let's just pick another key here. Let's say what about a key like E flat? What if I wanted to know where to place each of these positions for the key of E flat? I have to have a reference point on the 5th or the 6th string, for starters, finding my root. So if I want to look for roots on the 6th string for E flat, let's say, I've got to go pretty far because E is the open 6th string note. I can't go any lower than that. It's going to be way up the neck before I get another E flat. In fact, it's going to be here at 11th position is my next E flat. Well, if I'm looking for how to sequentially move up the neck, that doesn't do me much good. I need to find a lower one. So let's look at the 5th string. And if we have an open A here, then I need to go to B, C, D, E flats here on the 6th fret. Well, that's usable. I could start here putting my 4th finger onto that 5th string E flat, but there's probably even one possible chord shape at least that I could get a little bit lower, and that's using that one oddball shape, the D form. So I could play a D form here with my E flat on the 4th string. It's the oddball because it's the only one that has that 4th string root. And in fact, the scale position is not going to line up very nicely with this, but just so we can demonstrate how we found these positions. So there's my D form chord with my root E flat. When I progressed through each of these, you'll recall that we used this triangle shape here as a reference. We changed the fingering on that triangle, and that brought us to the C form chord where that root is on the 5th string. If I change that 5th string root from 4th finger to 1st finger, I can find the location for the A form. If I change the bar from 3rd finger to 1st finger, I can find the location for the G form. And now I have the 6th string root here with my 4th finger. If I change that to 1st finger, I've got the location for the E form. And my 4th finger is now on the root where I'm going to start over again with the D form chord. So those 5 positions, D form, C form, A form, G form, E form, we'll always progress up the neck in this order. All right, let's return to our key of G for the rest of this example. I think that's a little bit kinder to you practicing these because the diagrams are in G. So if you need that reference, you probably do with the scale diagrams. At least they'll be in the right location when we do these. I think we'll demonstrate them in a position somewhere in the middle of the neck. Let's say 7th position. So if I want to play the key of G in the 7th position, it's a little bit different way to conceive of the thing that we just did. If I want to play the key of G here in the middle of the neck, I need to find a root, and so here's a G root, the 10th fret of the 5th string. I can put my 4th finger on it, and that will have me playing the C form. So let's use the C form here in 7th position with that 10th fret G to demonstrate the rest of these examples about what we're going to do with scales here. I do want to make a quick note about some other resources that you could use to start learning these things. And the way that I learned them was originally from a book called The Berklee Method for Guitar, Modern Method for Guitar, Book 2. I have Book 3 here, but Book 2 looks just like this, except I think the writing is yellow and obviously a giant number 2 instead of number 3. That book has kind of an exhaustive study of some of the major keys. Not all of them. I think maybe there's 8 major keys in it, where it takes you from the low end of the neck to the high end of the neck through these scales, and they're all notated. There's no tab, there's no diagrams, they're just strictly notated, and it's a good way to learn these. I strongly suggest you pick up Berklee Book 2 and give it a shot. There's enough information there if you know how to read it that even if you didn't have the scale shapes, you could make use of these. They don't call them the C form, A form, G form, etc. They call them type 1, type 2, type 3, which I think is kind of a drawback because it doesn't really connect to anything else. But essentially it's the CAGED system for scales. They don't really get into the chord side. They don't really present it quite in the same way that I'm giving it to you here, which I think is a little bit more of a coherent system. But still, it's a useful study for how to practice these things moving up and down. I'll probably devote a video some point in the future to using that book and the exercise that it gives for the scales and just explaining just a brief introduction of how to make sense of what's there. Anyway, if you don't have that, you're not quite ready to think about the note names behind these things, then you can use these simpler pattern-based study systems that I'm about to give you here. And they'll work, even if you don't think about the note names, they'll still work for you to help digest some of the patterns. I do think that you should start to digest the note names. I think trying to play the guitar without understanding note names is like trying to drive around town without knowing the names of the streets. You can get there, probably you know some landmarks. I'm going to turn left at the KFC and go 6 blocks. That's how I'm going to get to my destination. But trying to communicate that information to other people without the street names is very tedious, and there's a lot of room for error. So particularly when it comes to communicating your musical ideas, interpreting other people's communications to you about musical ideas, the note names are pretty crucial. And beyond that, some at least rudimentary knowledge of scale theory and chord theory is pretty crucial. So I don't have a video up yet about scale theory and chord theory. When I do, I'll link it right here. And I strongly suggest that you start to absorb some of that information about the theory behind what these things are, how they're built, and what names you give notes, how to apply those up and down the neck of the guitar. That information is absolutely essential as far as I'm concerned, and the sooner you start to absorb some of that stuff, the better. Okay, so let's get back to our 7th position G scale here, which is the C form scale. And the way you're going to practice this is first with a metronome. Some kind of click, set slowly, on all the time. If you're doing your practice without a metronome, then you're just reinforcing sloppy timing. So you might as well just have it on. I'm not going to use it here because it can get a little bit obnoxious, but in your practice, I think you should have it on all the time. Now, when you're timing your work to this metronome, there's two main ways that you can divide those beats. You can divide them into duplets or into triplets. In other words, I can split the beat into subdivisions of 2s and multiples of 2, or I can split it into multiples of 3. Duplets versus triplets. You should do both because the way that impacts your picking and the accenting and everything is completely different in duplet time than it is in triplet time. So I'll try to give you a little bit of an example of both here. Simplest way to start this, obviously, is just playing up and down the scale. So you shouldn't do too much of that because it gets repetitive. You get into a rut. Let's just demonstrate the C form scale here. Just say we did it. Up and down one time. Now you'll notice I went all the way up, I came all the way down, and then I went and played the notes below the root that are available in the position. I came back and returned on the root. Talked a little bit about that in the last part, but I think you need to start on the root. You don't want to start your G scale somewhere else. It won't sound like a G scale, but you need to acknowledge that there are all these notes in the position below that, so go ahead and play them. Once you come down the scale, come back and finish on the root. It'll sound like a G scale that way. Okay, you've played the scale up and down. That gets old really fast, and you can only do so much of that. It's not going to really help impress the memorization factor here quite as much as some of these other things that you could do. Pattern-based exercises. Now, even these will only go so far for the memorization, but it has to be done. There's no way around it. I'm going to touch on a handful of the things that you could do with patterns, and there are almost infinite numbers of ways that you could permutate these patterns. And I'll try to give you some suggestions for how you might do that. But the simplest one I think you probably will come across is just to start from the root, skip a note, go to the third, come back down a step, skip up to the fourth, come down a step, skip up to the fifth, come down a step. So that's going to sound like this. I'm starting on the root G. I'm going to skip up, come down a step, skip up, down a step, skip up, down a step, skip up, down, skip, step down, skip up, step down. Now I'm at the top. The obvious choice from here is to reverse this pattern so that I go skip down, step up, skip down, step up, skip down, step up. However, you could keep the same direction. You could skip up, you notice there, I kept the movement the same, I just brought it back down versus reversing the pattern. In this example, it's not quite as apparent how that's different, but in the next one, you'll probably see the difference. So let's try a different sequence. Instead of just a 2-note sequence, let's do a 4-note sequence. So what if we do a pattern that's root, step, step, skip back to the root, and then we're going to take that whole series up. So it'll be root 2 3, root 2 3 4, 2 3 4 5 3. Sounds like this. Okay, now when it comes to going down, if I were to reverse it, which I think is the more obvious choice, here's what we get. If I keep the same pattern but step down with it, it sounds like this. There is a pretty substantial difference there, and you should be aware that you can reverse your pattern or you can step it down when you get to the top. It's important to do it both ways. If you do one and not the other, you're missing all of these different permutations of how you're going to be able to practice these patterns. Let's look at the same kind of pattern that we just did with that sequence of steps, but in a triplet version instead of a duplet version. So if I want to do something similar to that, but with triplets, I might go root 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5. So I take the skip out, and now rather than skipping back to where I started, I'm just going to step up. It sounds like this. If I reverse it, I get. Now, of course, I could go below on each one of these. Then I've got to work my way back up. So you have the reversing issue again. Okay, now if I didn't reverse it and instead I kept that same direction of moving up, but my ascending sequence steps down the scale, instead that would give me this. So hopefully you can appreciate the difference between those two things. Now before I move on to the next one, which is going to be more of a triad pattern, I want to say that there are a lot of variations that you could be doing on these ideas. I could do more complicated sequences of notes with the steps and the skips, like the second example that we just looked at. I could do different intervallic skips than we did in the first example, where we did skipping up a third, stepping down, skipping up. I could do fourths there. I could do fifths, sixths, sevenths. If you do sevenths, you're going to run out of room in the position pretty soon. But I think it's a good idea for you to explore what it sounds like when you do fourths or fifths. These start to get actually rather difficult because the guitar is built in fourths, and sometimes they just don't have very nice fingerings. So let's say I want to do fourths. Right away, you're going to hit this spot where, oh, the pattern doesn't work, and now I've got to really think about how this form is set up so that I'm going to make sure that I understand, all right, my fourths look like this, but then once in a while, one's augmented. And so what does that look like on the guitar, especially when I hit the goofy second string tuning? All of these things require some thought, and you can't really just learn fingering for it. You're going to have to actually understand the pattern. So I think it's a great idea to not just do the simple sequences and the simple intervallic relationships, but actually do some challenging ones. Try some fourths, try some fifths. We'll do now the triad shapes, and there are a lot of interesting things you could do with these too. Let's say I'm going to try to arpeggiate a triad up from the root. That means that I'm going to play root, third, fifth, and then my next one will be second, fourth, sixth, and I'm going to keep moving that 3-note triad of root, skip, skip up through the steps of the scale. That sounds like this. In this shape, I can get all the way through one octave of this, and then I run out. Now again, at the top, you've got this question of whether you're going to go back down reverse the whole thing, or whether you're going to keep the ascending movement of the pattern intact and then step that down. If I reverse it all, versus stepping down with the ascending intact, sounds like. It's a very different series that you get whether you choose one or the other, and I think you should do both. Now, when you get this triadic pattern started and you're thinking about how to move this up and down, that might be enough of a challenge for you right there. But I want you to keep in mind, you could be doing a descending pattern. You could be starting from the fifth and playing down to the root, and this is much harder. Let's say I'm going to keep that same root, third, fifth, but start from the fifth. Now I get this. And then you have that same consideration about which way you're going to go on the way down. I could do a 4-note series here. It doesn't have to be a 3-note triad. It could be a 4-note root, third, fifth, seventh. And then reversing that or stepping it down. The pattern that you do here doesn't really have to be one of these three groupings. We looked at the intervallic jump, we looked at the sequence of notes, and then we looked at the triadic or seventh chord shape. It could be some variation in between. Now you're getting into interesting combinations of what are really essentially just melodies that you're going to sequence up or down. And you could find some really interesting patterns and try to sequence that up throughout the scale shape. That's about all that we'll do here in terms of what kinds of patterns you could look at. You can come up with a lot of variations just based on what I gave you right there, and I think I'll just leave it at that, let you move forward with that. Okay, so one thing that I do want to touch upon before we get ready to go on to part 4, where we're going to talk about pentatonic scales, is the question of fingerings. Now, I've given you fingerings in the diagrams, and I've used them here, even though I didn't really talk too much about fingerings. I used them as if the fingerings on the diagrams are set in stone. Are they? No, of course not. And one of the complaints that people have about the CAGED system 5-position fingerings versus other ways that you might approach the guitar in a system with scale patterns and fingerings, for example, the 7-note system, the 3-note per string, the 7-position system, 3 notes per string, is that the fingerings can be a little awkward. And yes, the fingerings can be awkward, but I think for all the reasons I've talked about in previous videos, this is still a superior system. You should learn them with the fingerings that I've given you here, but when you need to adjust these fingerings, adjust them. There were moments in these patterns that I just did that were awkward fingerings. And for me, one of the things I don't like to do is having to lay down a finger to go from one string to the adjacent string on the same fret. I don't like doing that. There's a great video out there floating around with Sean Lane talking about this and how he uses 2 fingers to accomplish the same thing. Well, I'm going to try to give you my own interpretation of what that solution is, and then I'm going to show you a different solution to how you're going to deal with this problem. So just to show you what I'm talking about here, let's say I'm just going to do the up a third, step down, up a third, step down pattern, the one we did first. Right there, you hit this problem of adjacent string, same finger, same fret. And what I would prefer to do is use a different finger, because I think as you try to speed up a little bit, this makes it faster. You have to think harder. You have to be prepared, but ultimately this is a faster, more flexible approach to doing this than laying a finger down. Now, a lot of schools of thought on guitar instruction will teach you to lay the finger down. If you're learning classical guitar, you're going to be told to lay the finger down. In electric guitar, I think it's your choice. You can do it if you want. Certainly a lot of players do. I don't like to do it. I think that it's easier for me to use a different finger there. Let me show you what that looks like. So you'll notice when I got to that spot, rather than lay my finger down, I used another finger, and this kind of threw me out of position. Now I have to reach a little bit to come back here, but after that I can resume my position-based playing with the fingering that we've already talked about. So that requires a lot of practice because you have to really be ready for that. You have to know it's coming. You have to do it a lot of times for it to resemble anything that's habitual or automatic. But I think you should learn this. Whenever there are multiple approaches to things, I have, in my own study, tried to learn them all and decide later which one I'm going to prefer. Make sure that I've practiced them all equally so that I have choices, that I'm not sort of stuck in some habitual way of doing things and unaware of the other options. Let's look at a sequence and ways that you're going to have of dealing with a similar problem that comes up in a sequence that arises from the fact that in the 5-position scales, I think in all cases, I'm pretty sure in the 5-position scales, because of the tuning discrepancy here with the second string, you have a spot where there's only 2 notes on a string. That doesn't come up in the 7-position system. And it's one of the reasons that people like the 7-position system. But what I want to show you here is that there is this kind of compromise that you can do between the 5-position and the 7-position system, where you briefly entertain the idea that you could just put 3 notes on every string like you do in the 7-position system, but not really have to adjust the fingering in the long run that we gave you in the 5-position system. Let me show you what that looks like. All right, so let's say I've got a pattern. The pattern's important here, or sequence rather. Let me make sure I pick one that gives you this example. I think if we use that pattern that we did earlier, this comes up, the sequence where you go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2. Yeah, it does. Okay. If you see what I did right there, I actually took this note that's a first finger note, the F sharp on the second string, and because I knew this problem of the fingering was going to come up, I moved that note here as if I was doing the 3-note per string variation of this pattern. Now, if I show you how that works, let's start it again from the bottom. Right here, if I play this next F sharp on the second string, I'm going to have to lay my first finger flat because when I start the next cycle of this pattern, I've got to do it here with the same finger. So I have to know that's coming, lay this finger flat, and be ready to do kind of a bar here to put the next part of the pattern down in the right place and not have this little stutter that has to happen if oh wait, I didn't think about that, and now I got to jump my finger back because I'm on the tip and I didn't lay it down. Well, this process of adjusting your sense of where that 2-note part, 2-note per string part of the pattern is, actually gets you past that, but it is even more mentally intensive than the last thing that we just did about adjusting the finger. If I take that F sharp and I put it here just for this one instance of the pattern, then it totally erases this need to lay my finger flat. If I get to that spot and put the F sharp here just this one time, and then continue on as if I'm going to resume the fingering that I had, it just erases the need to lay any fingers flat at all. And in every one of the 5 positions, there is a way to do this. Sometimes it's stretching the 4th finger, sometimes it's putting a note up here with a little stretch with the 1st finger, but wherever you get that 2-note per string instance in these 5 positions, you can find a way to overcome this need to lay down a finger or use a repetitive finger on that same fret. So I think that there's a lot of ways that this issue comes up, and most of the time when you hear people complaining about why they don't like the 5-position caged fingerings, it probably has something to do with an issue like this. And I think just a little bit of creative forethought about how you're going to overcome that using some of these techniques I just showed you will probably help you alleviate the problems that you might foresee with the 5-position system. So with that in mind, I think we've gone over enough stuff here that we're ready to just put that on you for how you're going to start to learn this in all the different positions and all the different keys. Like I said, I think there are some great resources out there for you to do this and learn the note names. Think about the scale theory behind it, and we talked about the Berklee Book 2. If you're ambitious, go for it. Buy Berklee Book 2 and start to learn all these things with note names. Some of the other stuff that we're going to talk about later will start to help reinforce some of this idea about playing scales according to their note names and thinking about scale theory and stuff. But that's enough for now. We've gone on long enough. Come down here, click here. We're going to start to talk about pentatonics in part 4. Thanks very much.